Welcome to the Behaviour Speak podcast. Now, here's your host, Ben Ryman.
Welcome to another episode of the Behaviour Speak podcast. I'm your host, Ben. Today, we're chatting across the pond with Dr. Darren Bowring. I discovered Darren's work a few years back as I've had a lot of interest over the years in kind of what the UK and other countries kind of across the sea have been doing in terms of PBS. I'm as a lot of folks know, I'm kind of in the PBS realm, and I've always been interested in kind of what the UK has been doing ever since I sort of discovered some of kind of the early work of like Mansell and Hastings and some of those folks. And I hadn't really seen research in this area that was sort of outside of kind of the Oregon core of Horner and those folks, and of course Lavinia and Willis in California, and to sort of see that some folks are doing some really good work in other parts of the world in PBS, and most notably I think the UK and Australia. I really got interested in kind of following the work, and so Darren's work really kind of struck me because he's just doing some really neat things around designing PBS teams, and he's got I really like sort of his thoughts around quality of life and some of the kind of neat things he's doing in terms of medication and kind of overprescribing medication to the folks we serve. So really excited to kind of chat about a topic that I'm passionate about. Normally I talk to people about topics I know nothing about, and it's just a learning experience, and so I'm looking forward to kind of diving into something that I've spent a lot of time in. So Darren, thanks a lot for being on the show.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure, Ben. Thank you for inviting me.
Wonderful. So Darren, maybe we might just get started and kind of with a bit of an origin story, and maybe you can sort of tell the folks kind of how you got into the field and how you came to sort of the realm of PBS and then eventually to kind of the work you're doing now.
Yeah, well, I guess my story started over a bit more near yourselves, over your side of the pond, when I finished university as a graduate and was considering what to do next, and ended up getting a summer placement at a summer camp in Wisconsin in the USA, working with children that had some challenging behaviour at the time. And that led to a role in a school back in the UK following that summer placement, which was a school for children that had been excluded from a number of schools in London, what was called a school for children with emotional and behavioural difficulties at the time. And although we didn't know it in the early 90s, I guess we were working to a very much a PBS model in terms of our approach, in terms of shying away from some of the punishment and restrictive type models that have been used on these children very unsuccessfully in the past, and working to try to understand why they were behaving in the way that they were, and working to actually try to meet their needs and work a bit more therapeutically in terms of understanding that a lot of their behavior was based on distress and the deficient environments they'd accessed. So I guess I fell into it, and then I started, with some of my academic roots, doing master's degrees in emotional and behavioural issues, and then very eventually doing a master's degree in ABA at Bangor. Under you talk of founders of PBS, the Bangor cohort was very much the people who were behind PBS in the UK in terms of Sandy Toogood and Carl Hughes and Richard Hastings and others at the time. So by going down that route, I eventually moved to Jersey, set up a PBS team, a community-based PBS team in Jersey, which is a small island, a British Crown dependency off the coast of the UK. And for the last 15 years, I guess, I've developed the PBS service over here. I completed a Ph.D, which was very much based on PBS. I've continued to do some research since in PBS with an honorary research position at the University of Warwick. And I've also been involved with the British Institute of Learning Disabilities as well, in terms of being a PBS consultant, and pretty much taken a lead with PBS training and PBS conferences and education in the UK. So I've had a role there in terms of contributing to that training and speaking at conferences and other events that they've had. So it's been an exciting time, I would say, over the last 10 years for PBS. We've seen quite a growth in the UK starting, I guess the community model was really exploded back in 2015 with some of the nice guidance that was happening at the time, and some of the papers such as the National Plan Building Up the Right Support, which was published by NHS England, which really recommended this idea of having specialist community-based behavioural services that could work with other practitioners and move away from this model where historically people with learning disabilities would be placed in inpatient type settings, restrictive type group homes or hospital type settings where medication was prevalent, restrictive practices were prevalent. So, I guess the push in England was to very much move away for this community-based model and think about how we can sustain people in their environment. So, I think the way I've benefited from some of this, I like to think that I've had an academic focus through this, but tried to keep my academic work based on very practical based contributions in terms of what's happening in the real world, and keep some of the research based on real world experiences and practice. And I guess that's what PBS is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. So what exactly, as far as makes sort of a specialist community-based PBS service sort of differ from other kind of practices?
Well, I guess particularly in Jersey, the positive behaviour support service over here sits, as many others do in the UK, as part of a much wider multidisciplinary learning disability service. And I think that's important. And I think it's important because we know that the PBS model, it's been described by others. I think Smith described it as a package. Some other academics and practitioners have described it as a framework. So I see PBS as bigger than simply the science of behaviour, although that's fundamental to the work that we do. Mm-hmm. But it's bigger. And I think some of the adults that we work with, their lives and consequently some of the behaviour that we experience is shaped much more than mere environmental and functional type moments in their lives. So a lot of the early research that we did was based on trying to understand, for example, what some of the vulnerability factors were towards the presentation of challenging behaviour. And I use that term carefully, and I use that term because it's widely used in academia, but I also used it to place the onus within the environment and within deficient environments as opposed to a label for people. But I guess if you look at any of the research that's been done previously on vulnerability factors to behaviour, or some of the work that we did in Jersey to that, it's quite clear that we see much higher levels of challenging behaviour where there's certain factors at play for people with learning disabilities. So, for example, the work I did and the work others have done, there's much higher propensity of challenging behaviour in people that have communication impairments or more severe intellectual disabilities. So that instantly gives us the idea that if we get communication right early, then surely that's a protective factor going forward in terms of the future occurrence of challenging behaviour. And I guess that's why, to me, this idea of having an MDT looking at behaviour is important, because we know that other vulnerability factors outside of communication are things like impaired health. And we know that people with learning disabilities tend to have poorer health outcomes than others. And we know that poorer health is also a vulnerability factor for challenging behaviour. We also know, for example, that lack of engagement has been deemed an issue in the past. Mm-hmm. When I did a piece of research in 2017 on over 200 adults with learning disabilities on Jersey, we found 40% had no daytime engagement whatsoever. And of that cohort, wow, a lot quantity of those were in that list we would describe as challenging. So we need to be working on that. We need to be understanding people's sensory issues and that. So here in Jersey, within our team, we have community nurses working on health promotion, working with the hospitals so people can access services. We have occupational therapists working on engagement levels, skill teaching, enabling people to be able to get their own needs met in terms of personal care. We know that group homes and residential housing has been linked to high levels of behavioural challenge in the past. So we've got social workers working with people, making sure that their rights are met, making sure that they get choice of where they live, who they live with, who supports them. So I see this concept of challenging behaviour as bigger than me going and doing a functional assessment. There's lots of other layers within this that requires other practitioners. Psychologists are important in terms of some of the therapeutic aspects and talking therapies and contributions in terms of formulation they can bring. Psychiatry is important as well, particularly in understanding where there's associated mental health comorbidities. So we need bigger teams around people, and I think that's what PBS is about. It's not just about me as a behavioural practitioner. It's about having this group of staff, this group of people that helps. And I've seen people's behaviour transform by moving house, or transform by being given some mobility support, or improved because we've got their epilepsy under control, or improved because an OT's done a sensory profile assessment and we've understood some of the sensory issues they find aversive and made adaptations to their environments or support around that. So it's a bigger thing, and I think that's what PBS is, and that's where the community teams come into it in the UK, being part of this wider network of practitioners to work holistically around people.
Awesome. So these are like sort of some of the terms I think over here we've used. They're like wraparound or transdisciplinary kind of teams. And so all these folks are I guess these are sort of relationships and partnerships you've sort of built over the last sort of 15 years. And so all these folks are pretty collaborative. I think this is sometimes an area where over here we kind of struggle, where I think there's the phrase play nicely in the sandbox, as it were, with sort of these other professionals. And so do you find that the relationships are pretty good, and that some of these other professionals are supportive of kind of the PBS approach?
Absolutely. I think the ethos of PBS runs absolutely through our whole services over here, right down to the support on the ground, and in terms of what we deliver through some charitable providers and through our families. I think that comes down because we've had some very key individuals, such as myself and others, who have acted as really good practice leaders for the PBS approach. And I guess it's easier in Jersey. If we think Jersey's a very small island, 8x5, 100,000 people, the MDT Learning Disability Service is in one building on one floor where everybody works together, and they work together day in, day out. So if anywhere should get it right, it's in an environment such as this, where we are very close, and when we can all collectively visit people every day because we're in such a small island. So I think it works because we're all together collectively as one team.
Yeah.
The environments where I see it doesn't work is where you have distinct services that people are trying to refer to each other, and services are very busy as well. And we know that. We know PBS services in the UK are hugely in demand. There's a shortage of behaviour analysts and shortage of psychologists at the moment as well. So I know it's difficult gaining access sometimes to practitioners and services. That's why I think it's important, to think of when we design these services, to think in mind with a behavioural model. What works? Well, good relationships work. That's what works with good PBS, and that also applies in our organisational behaviour management, I guess, in terms of how do we create teams.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a really important point, the idea that it's not just about finding the function and manipulating SDs and MOs and those sorts of things. The simple fact of I love your point of just moving someone from a different residence can make all the difference, because often I think a lot of the problems we see over here, particularly in these group home settings, are individuals that had no choice in living with each other. And it's really just and if you go back to your college days, it's just really living with a really bad roommate, and all of the sorts of feelings and annoyances and stress that one goes through by living with someone that they're not getting along with, add a lack of communication skills and potentially a staff team that's maybe more focused on the other guy because of other needs or whatnot, and suddenly you've got a whole lot of different problems. And so simply just moving someone from one place to another is often all you need.
Yeah. I don't for 1 minute believe we've got it totally right over here as well. If I think back 15 years ago, a lot of people I work with would be we moved from the hospital type, institutional setting to a group home setting. And we've moved now where we have many more people who have their own homes with their own tenancies that are bespoke designed with their own staff team around them. So we've made really good progress, and I see dramatic reductions in levels of challenges once people have their own homes that they have that are designed to meet their needs, and they can choose everything in them, but choose what they do, choose who supports them. But the flip side of that is that, I worry sometimes as well that people then become isolated. We don't have the same scrutiny over staff as well. We have staff working maybe on a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. And, the wards weren't appropriate, but on the wards, we had nurses, we had staff keeping an eye on other staff. We had much more social aspects of different people around. So I think we have to be careful that we do this in a way where the person and their family lead this at the heart. And they make the decisions about where they live, who they live with, who supports them, the type of property that they live in. And if it's not right once they've experienced, we change and we move again. And we give them lots of experiences like we all do in our lives. None of us tend to stay in the same place. We move and we live with different people and we have different relationships and we move for work. And I think life's been very different for people with learning disabilities. And I think, some of the learning is it needs to be, that the whole model requires some sort of review. So we are getting it better and we understand some of the deficiencies in the current models.
And if I heard you right, I think you made a really interesting point about, and somewhat, ironic too, I guess, is the idea that folks kind of move from a congregate care kind of setting into community, because we want to deinstitutionalize and sort of all those pieces that are related there, but we don't think about the actual socializing that was happening in those institutions. And not to say that those were great places and that we should reopen them and bring back institutionalization. That's certainly not my point at all. But the fact is, there is a lot more when you have sort of 800 people living on a floor or whatnot. There is inherently a lot more opportunities for some kind of socialization versus moving into a group home alone with one roommate who you may or may not get along with. And then we don't think about sort of, we've got to now rebuild these social networks. I kind of think about when I was consulting for an agency, and it was one of the early agencies in British Columbia, so it took a lot of the folks from institution, and I discovered that a lot of the folks that were living in sort of the different group homes, not living together, were actually all from the same floor of the institution that they had lived in sort of 20 years ago. In essence, they were kind of ripped away from all their friends and moved into these sort of group home settings. And so, one of the things I kind of want to regret, because I had to sort of leave and leave town. But one thing I really kind of wanted to work on was, how can we sort of, in a thoughtful sort of way, reunite the folks living in institutions that were, together from childhood often.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think to me, sometimes we have to continually remind ourselves not to try and impose our own values and ideas on other people. And, I've been reflecting over the last 18 months, particularly with the COVID pandemic and issues with lockdown. And I've been to a couple of virtual conferences and workshops since. And what has interested me is anecdotal reports that providers have said that during the lockdown period, they reported much fewer challenges. And that conversations happen time and time again. And that's interesting to me. And we encourage our staff to go into work and keep people busy and promote community access and make sure people are having social opportunities and they're getting vocational opportunities. And yet during lockdown, when that wasn't available, we see lower levels of challenges. And I reflect back and think, why is that? Is that because our idea of what is good quality of life for some people isn't actually what they want? And we are causing people more distress by implementing our view of what we think an ideal day and world. And we're pushing staff to do what we think is their ideal day and world on other people's lives. So again, it comes back to this heart of this thing with PBS in terms of where people live or what they do. is how do we make sure people have good self-determination and they can influence their own lives? And I'm convinced that we would see much lower levels of issues if we got better at that.
If you'd like to collect continuing education credits for this episode, you'll need to go to www.cbiconsultants.com and enter the 3 secret words. The first secret word is quality. When we had kind of at our pre-chat, we started kind of talking about quality of life, and I really kind of liked your thinking in this area. Just sort of, and maybe we can reflect on this and reflect a bit on your outcome study on community-based PBS. Just kind of looking at kind of how we define success in PBS. Is it just a matter of no challenging behavior? Is it this sort of quality of life idea? Sort of what determines that success? Because I think you touched on a really good point. We've spent a lot of time doing some research, in terms of quality of life. Dr. Shallock is probably one of the most widely known sort of researcher in that area, and he's come up with some really interesting tools and had them validated and whatnot. And there's been some other ones since then that have been into place, but and sometimes you look at sort of the and it really made me think, because sometimes you look at sort of the scoring on these sheets. And I remember I did a Shallock quality of life survey years ago with a group home that I was managing, but before I became a behavior analyst, and all the residents kind of came up really low in terms of quality of life. But anecdotally, visually, they all seemed quite happy. For whatever reason, being in the state they were in, it just made me wonder: Are quality of life measures, are they biased? Are they too old? I'm sort of, I really know the question here. I guess the question is what are successful PBS outcomes, and how do we kind of assess that?
Yeah, most individuals get referred to PBS teams because of concerns around challenging behaviour, and that's probably the first part. So there's obviously a goal and target to reduce that, and if we see the behavioural challenges as distress and reactions to deficient environments and supports, then there's obviously a need for us to tackle that issue. The prime aim of PBS has always been the promotion of quality of life. And not only is it an outcome that we hope to achieve for people, it's also an intervention. So we know that if we improve people's quality of life, we will see natural and secondary reductions in levels of challenging behaviour. Before we get into the more behavioural analytic type approaches that we need to look at. So I think that's really important. And in the study that we did in Jersey on 85 people referred to the PBS service, and there, we saw a direct correlation between improvements in their quality of life and reductions in levels of challenging behaviour. So there's certainly evidence that if you improve people's quality of life, you see a reduction in challenging behaviour. So that's one thing. So I think it is an important area that we need to focus on. I think if you look at the domains, the existing domains, the Shallock domains, for example, Shallock comes up with 8 domains. I think if you go through them, invariably you will go through them all and say, yeah, people with learning disabilities have been done a bad deal with some of these. So, you go through physical well-being. We know people have poorer health outcomes. Material well-being. We know that very few people with learning disabilities have jobs. Most in Jersey receive benefits and live in some sort of supported accommodation. Social inclusion is another domain. I've already said that 40% of adults over here have no daytime engagement. We know that that's not good. We know they have poor rights. That's why we have charities trying to campaign about people with learning disabilities, these rights. And you go through the list of domains of quality of life, and you know that we haven't got it right. And there's a way to go in terms of improving some of this. My thoughts on this are, though, in terms of that, PBS is a science. It's a database science, as is ABA. And yet we struggled with finding how we assess and measure quality of life. And if we can't assess and measure it, how can we demonstrate that we're improving it and we're doing better? So there are a number of measures. a lot of us have scrambled around for different measures. There was a systematic review about 6 years ago by Townsend White and colleagues that looked for quality of life measures for services involved with challenging behaviour and found none were ideal. So we know that that's a starting place that we come from, but we don't have ideal measures, which makes it difficult. So there's some work to do there. There's some work by our academic colleagues and others to try to develop some better tools that we can use. And I guess my view on some of this as well is that the domains that we have in existence, although relevant, I still believe that looking at them, I think some of them are a little bit old-fashioned, a bit historic, certainly westernized in terms of some of them. And whether they would reflect the quality of life targets of the neurodiverse community that we support and adults with learning disabilities, I don't think so. We have on there, the second one on a Sherlock domain is material well-being. And again, would that come up as most of us in terms of our main quality of life goal? It might do for some. For a lot of others, it wouldn't. The vocational bit, I've got an adult that I've supported for a number of years, an autistic adult that has fascinating conversations with me that says, why do people go to work? He simply can't understand it. Why would you want to get up in a prescriptive way every day and go to jobs where people complain about and invariably do something you don't really enjoy when you can do other things, which is a wonderful way of viewing life and the world. With him, we're still trying to work whether he can do some self-employed bits around some of his wonderful skills he has as well to offer back. But there's an element when I look at some of these quality of life domains and everything, I think, are they really relevant to the people that we support? And can we use them as a baseline and as a target? And I'm not sure we get it quite right. I am encouraged by there's a charity in the UK called Stay Up Late. I really like Stay Up Late. Stay Up Late are quite rock and roll charity. So this is a bit of a shameless plug for them.
Yes, please.
And they started up with a very good strap line for people with learning disabilities, the campaign to let people stay up late. And this comes back from those institutional days where there was 8 or 9 p.m. handovers of staff and people would have to be in their pajamas and getting ready to bed because of a staff handover. And you go to the night staff and there's not enough people to take you out. So you don't see people with learning disabilities in pubs and clubs and concerts and gigs and issues like that. So Stay Up Late started out campaigning for that. And they have a group of gig buddies in the UK and to support people go to gigs. And so I think this is amazing. This is great stuff. So they've come up with a manifesto for an ordinary life. These are things that people with learning disabilities have repeatedly told them that they want in their life. Now, some of these are associated with the original quality of life domain, but some of them are different. So, people are telling them they not only want a sex life, they want sex. That's one of the top quality of life. They don't want to be told what time they go to bed. They want to decide how they spend their time. They want to choose where they live and who they live with, who supports them. They want to choose happy staff who like their job, no matter what their qualifications are. They want to have a proper paid job with a good income. And they want to have not to have bad stuff said in the media about them. So these are different. These are different goals. And I'd imagine if you sat down with other people, with autistic adults and there might be different goals. And quality of life is bespoke. It's particular to me as it is to you. And what we each like in our life is different. And also, I think what makes us happy is potentially different to what makes for a good quality of life. So we've got this whole mix of things that I'm not sure that we have totally straightened out and we don't have totally clear. But what we need to reflect back is to whoever we get referred to us, to our services, the place to start is allow them to influence their life and for us to reflect back, how can we work with them so they have good self-determination, so they influence the life that they want. And we sit down and we work out not what our values are, not what their family's values or their staff values. What do they want? What makes a good quality of life for them? What makes them happy? And can we work from that as the academics and everybody around us improve the use of the tools and other bits for us to work with? But I think that's important. And I think that's what separates PBS from a lot of others. It does have this ethical, clear drive towards quality of life. And I think certainly when we talked earlier about what PBS teams do, it's not just, PBS teams do functional assessments, and they're really important. And at the heart, I'm an ABA practitioner as well, and that's important. And without that level of skill, I don't think we make the differences that we could. But PBS practitioners in teams also need to be looking at these quality of life issues and supporting endeavours towards that. So getting involved, I would suggest people need to get involved in, vocational promotions in their local area. How can we get more people with learning disabilities into work? 6% in the UK. Post-COVID, hospitality is in crisis at the moment. Can't get staff. Businesses shutting down. Yet we have 6% of people with learning disabilities in employment. Absolutely wrong. Why can't we do that? So why are, we're not seeing people learning in nightclubs and in pubs? I go round and in my training, and I get a row of hands up from staff to say, how many of you have tattoos? And we get probably, every time I do it, about half the room up. And I think back in the UK at the moment, I think it's about 45% of adults have tattoos. And then you look at how many adults with learning disabilities have tattoos. Very few. And I say that not to encourage people to go out and take people to tattoo shops, but I think it's a reflection that we're all able to make decisions that sometimes other people would look at as reckless and wrong and probably not right. But we're able to make them because we're not controlled as other people are around us. And maybe people with learning disabilities do want tattoos, but invariably they don't get them because they're not able to make those choices that others might see as bad, never mind the ones that people would see as good. So we have huge amounts to do until people are accepted as ordinary citizens and having this ordinary life that the Stay Up Late campaign is urging.
Wow, that's that sounds just like such an amazing group. Everything you're saying, it just resonates so much. Again, the idea of sort of shutting down life at 9 o'clock when the evening staff come on, and I think I've had sort of these rare occasions where someone has been able to go to sort of one concert a year or something, because we'll spend 3 months rejigging the schedule so that two staff will stay a couple hours later one night, and we'll pay them triple overtime or something, and that'll make it work. And it's always a successful, wonderful thing, but it just happens sort of once. And so I think that's brilliant. A lot of these things you bring up, though, are often considered kind of really taboo topics in kind of adult kind of community living settings. To talk about an autistic adult with potentially an intellectual disability or whatnot, being permitted to have sex is just something many organizations and many leaders would just you just don't bring that stuff up. That's just too taboo. That's just not something you're allowed to do. The idea that the people living in not only have sex, but could possibly be not heterosexual. I think there's a real assumption there that in fact they're all asexual in some way. Particularly the folks that maybe don't have verbal language to kind of communicate. And so I think all this stuff. I don't see quality of life surveys asking, do they get to have sex? I don't see quality of life surveys saying, do they get to drink till they have a headache and vomit? And then wake up at 3 a.m. and go for breakfast at a 24-hour diner.
And get a tattoo on the way home.
And how many folks with a tattoo do you know that are whose lives are automatically ruined because they've gotten this tattoo? And so I think PBS is a really individualized practice. We really spend a lot of time focusing on getting to know the person and getting to know their likes and dislikes and strengths and wants, and it's a very collaborative process. But then to have it finish off with an outcome that's not individualized at all. Quality of life is not an individualized measure. It's a very generalized assumption that in order to have a good life, you need A, B, C, D, and E. But then you talk about, that fella who quite, brilliantly articulated, what's the point of a job, especially in a system that, provides funding, provides housing for some of these folks. And so I've already got a home, I've already got food, I've already got, shelter and people to talk to. Why would I want to leave it and go do something I don't like?
Yeah, and that's what he says to me. And that's exactly what he says to me. He says, look at the qualifications I got from school. I'd end up stacking shelves in a supermarket. He said, I'd hate it. I'd have to interact with so many people every day that would make me anxious, and it would be awful to experience. And I'd end up taking less money than I do from my existing benefits. He said, why would I put myself through any of that? Why do you all put yourself through that? And, there's aspects of that I admire as well. When we reflect back, why have we all got into these routines? I go home learning from the people, from me, and I'm thinking, why have we gone into these? Why am I getting up each day doing this? And then for this couple of weeks of holiday every year where we live, and we need to look at that as well. And I think that's why this PBS model also, I think particularly when in terms of my application, it's about staff as well. About how we apply the same principles to the staff and the people that are working with us and supporting us. How can we apply the same behavioral principles of reinforcement, allowing them to influence their lives, their shifts? We're doing lots of work at the moment about flexi work, and people can, don't have to start at prescriptive times. They've got families. How can we work with them when they're supporting individuals? How can they, how can we match people up? If I've got a love of football, how can I match me up with an adult with a learning disability that loves football? So we both get to do things on our, when I come into work and I can support that adult, we can go and watch the football. And so I think that stuff's really important as well. So we get really good shared meaning, and we work with the people that provide this support, which is so crucial, not only in terms of training, so they understand the PBS approach and that, but we apply it to them and their lives and the way we treat them as well.
I'm curious, this is sort of a side thing. I didn't really talk about this, but I'm curious about sort of how one of the big barriers, I think, for us, kind of, at least in sort of my neck of the woods, to kind of, developing these systems where, folks can, like you say, like a flexi shift or like matching staff interests and whatnot. I mean, I think those are all really excellent ideas, and folks have had them before. Probably one of the biggest barriers for us and for the settings and kind of these sort of, residential care kind of settings is that all of our staff are unionized. Are staff unionized in the UK? Does it work that way in sort of, these kind of residential programs and whatnot? Do you know?
Yeah, I guess most people would belong to a union, whether they're as vocal and organised and militant as potentially historically some unions have been. I wouldn't say so. Yeah. But certainly when we talk about changing terms and conditions, it invariably involves union representation as well when it's done collectively as well. So I guess it would remain an issue. Yeah, certainly. The type of things I'm thinking of, though, in terms of our approach, in terms of practice leadership and good leadership and showing care for our staff. One of my early managers said to me when I asked if I could finish early because my dad wasn't well, it stuck with me my entire career. He said, if you can't look after your own family and show dedication when they need it, how can I possibly trust you to look after other people's? And that stuck by me. Throughout. So, we need to look after our staff. We need to realize they have families and show some understanding to that, and try to make sure that they're happy, that we make their work happy, and we reinforce that. We can't always do it with pay. That's one of the other issues. Certainly in the UK, it's very low paid work. And I do believe that's an issue. And if I could do something about that I would. But if we can't do anything about that, at least we can try to make sure that their working shift is enjoyable, that they get to do something that they enjoy to be doing. We give them feedback, we support them, we develop them with qualifications and experiences, and look at them in terms of their quality of life and happiness as well. Because it's we're talking about systems, people systems here, aren't we? And and environments, and it all contributes to this concept of why we either get challenging behavior or we don't.
Does this all fall under this realm of kind of practice leadership that you're talking about?
I think so. I think practice leadership is absolutely crucial. And I think quite often I can tell early on when I go into settings whether we will be able to make a difference or not. I think it was Rob Horner that says a PBS plan, it's not a plan for an individual, it's a plan about how we get to change staff behaviour. And it's their behaviour plan, really. And I think how we change the culture sometimes is really difficult in these settings. How do we get people to work with us in terms of, particularly when we're doing functional assessments and we want people to change their responses and change their antecedent approaches, change their reactive approaches as well. I guess we touched on vulnerability factors. We haven't necessarily touched on impact factors and maintaining processes too much yet. Certainly when we're doing functional assessments and people are involved in the data, and that, I think that's the crucial bit. And I think it's really helpful that behavior analysts work with people at that point, and the data is shaped up together, and people get data put in ways they can understand in visual means. And from that data, we collaboratively develop behavior support plans as a result. So obviously the person is at the heart of that. The adult with learning disability or the autistic adult is at the heart of that. But we also need to include the people that are going to be, we want to make changes, be that parents, be that teachers, be that residential staff. And I think it's that crucial stage. And it's that stage, if we think about behavior support plans, we know the evidence for if they've got good contextual fit. So by which point I mean, if people have contributed to them, that they own them, that they can actually deliver the interventions, that they're not these wild pie in the sky approaches, they're realistic, they're real world. And if they've contributed to them and they own them, then I certainly think we get people more on board and we get greater fidelity. And then we get fidelity and then we see an improvement. And then we're going in saying, fantastic, you're making such a difference to this person's life. I'm so thrilled at the difference you're making. And at the same time, we're using behavior analytic processes with the staff in terms of how we change their behavior. And I think that's the way we need to be. And I've seen some behavior analysts who come in and produce a report that just gets filed away. I've seen some behavior analysts come into settings and be super skilled analysts and come up with wonderful plans, but have been unable to change the culture. So I always try to find out who the key person there, who is a key person that influences the culture, and how do we get them on side. Having them as that practice leader, and it's sometimes not the person you would expect. It's not sometimes a manager. Sometimes it's a really grumpy teacher that controls the staff room, or it's the old school member of staff that's been there 20 years and left the army and believes people need discipline. It's those type of people we need to turn around and get on board and get on top of this work, because they have the greatest influence in terms of changing the culture. And once you have them on board and able to engage, that's how you then begin to change the cultures, and we see improvements again for people. It's that application. How do we change? We don't want to change that person. We're not fixing that person's behavior. They're behaving in ways because their environment, the support, everything happening around them isn't correct. And we need to get people to change that, to make changes for them. So there's lots to do in that area, I would suggest as well.
Yeah, it's I love that. So opposite, I think, to a lot of the approaches I've seen in the past, where you walk into a program and it'll be that brand new staff, the young staff who's sort of maybe fresh out of college, who's really excited and keen to kind of do the work. And they're often sort of picked as the key implementer or the champion for the program. Yeah. And they're the ones that are given that training. And sure enough, they do a wonderful job. But like you said, you've got, a term we often use, and I don't know if it's appropriate or not, but it's kind of legacy staff. So staff that have just been, with that individual for 10, 20 years, and moved up the seniority ladder and sort of has the best hours or whatever, but is also often the one that will say, yeah, we tried all that 10 years ago, or someone came in and tried to do that and it just didn't work.
Doesn't work.
And what we really need to do is, unfortunately, what we really need to do is take a hard line and just have a firm voice and just watch. I'll just tell him, sit down, and he will, and that keeps everybody safe. The idea of sort of going to that person and making that person the champion is just, it's hard for me to grasp. It makes so much sense what you're saying. I mean, if you can get this guy on board, it could totally change the system. But how do you get that guy on board? Does practice leadership in itself in the UK? Like, I've never heard that term. I've heard it mentioned a couple of times. Sorry, I guess listening to the PBS Matters podcast there, which is done by a couple of folks over there, and they interviewed a fella. What was his name? Roy DeVoe. Yes, thank you. And unfortunately, in that particular episode, Roy's voice volume was so low, I really struggled to hear it. But he apparently he does a lot of work in that area. Is there a lot of like research and kind of practice leadership kind of happening over there that kind of comes up with sort of strategies to sort of get these folks on board?
Yeah, well, I think there's growing amounts of work on this, and I know the work that's been done in the TISARD, particularly around Julie Beadle-Bowring, Peter McGill, is talk about capable environments as well, and we use that term in PBS a lot. How do we develop these capable environments in the first place? And some of the work of Roy DeVoe, Peter McGill has talked about this idea of practice leaders, and these are the frontline leaders of the teams in this service, and making sure they have good knowledge about PBS. Making sure that they can support the implementation of all of the interventions, making sure that they coach and they organize the staff. They make sure that they put the environmental adaptations into place, make sure the visual timetables are updated every day with the person. So I think there's growing amounts of research that is indicating that this is where the difference can be made in terms of success or not, is having these practice leaders. And my view is, behavior analysts, surely behavior analysts are the best to change the behavior of a member of staff. And we think about, this is really hard, we can't do that. But surely we've got years of training in behavior change. Yep. Why can't we start with the very people that cause the hurdles in these settings?
Yeah.
And surely we have the skills and experience to be able to do that. And it comes back to having a relationship, to understanding what that person says, involving them in not telling them what to do, like as we wouldn't do with the people we support, but making sure that they have self-determination, that they're involved, and we do listen, and then we work alongside them and say, I think this is going on. Look at what the data's saying here. Look at the data. We've had 9 incidents this week. They've all been around meal times. What do you think that indicates? Well, and trying to get them, trying to work alongside them to get them to come to their own conclusions by using our data, by using our visuals, by using our explanations, that we're not forcing people. And they come up with an idea about, it is about meal times, isn't it? I've always wondered about whether we should be doing something like this. Do you know what? That's a great idea. Why don't we try that for the next few weeks? I'll come in and watch. We'll organize it differently and we'll see if that makes a difference. Lo and behold, it does. Then you single out that grumpy staff member as what a change he's made to managers. He's doing a fantastic job. Look at what difference he's made already. We're down 9 incidents a week since his little tweak at meal times. So I think it's possible. I think and I think we have the skills to do that. And if we don't, we need to reflect on our training a little bit, because we're meant to be behavior change agents.
Absolutely. I want to go back to something you mentioned that you said we didn't touch on. One thing I like about folks are doing in the UK around PBS is that, is looking at sort of kind of redefining and sort of upgrade is the right term, but upgrading kind of what a PBS model kind of should look like, what a framework should look like. On our side of the world, everything kind of goes back to sort of that seminal Ted Carr article, The Evolution of PBS. And that really is the, sort of seminal piece that we kind of still to this day kind of base most of kind of what we do on. We have done some research in some specific areas, but I really like what's kind of been happening in the UK around. So there was that Hastings et al. In 2013, where they kind of just redefined an entire framework of PBS, which I highly recommend folks, especially on this side of the world, kind of take a look at and get some ideas from. But then you've done some work more recently, and you mentioned the vulnerability factors, which kind of remind me a lot in a lot of ways of kind of these sort of setting events. Is kind of the phrase I've heard in sort of the O'Neill et al. And Horner camp version. But you've also kind of done some interesting things around these maintaining processes and impact factors. And I just wanted to kind of talk about what those are and kind of what you found there. The second secret word is medication.
Yeah, of course. Well, the papers you refer to, the 2013 papers in the International Journal of PBS, very much set us on the track in the UK in terms of defining PBS based on UK practice. And interestingly, later this year, there's going to be an update to the definitions as well. So there's some work ongoing with that at the moment. And there is a PBS International PBS conference taking place in Glasgow in October. And hopefully that will be the launch of some updates to the definition. So I would urge people to keep an eye out for that. One of the papers in that edition, though, was a paper by Hastings and et al., where they looked at the causal factors for challenging behaviour. And in the 2019 paper that I did alongside Richard Hastings, we did some work on that to try to update it based on some of the more recent research we found. So within this causal model, if you can picture at the moment, we have challenging behaviour that sits in the middle. And we know that challenging behaviour is influenced by the set of vulnerability factors that sit before it. So we know that with adults with intellectual disabilities who have certain vulnerability factors appear at greater risk of presenting challenging behaviour. So I'll review those quickly in a minute. So we have vulnerability factors that contribute to challenging behaviour. We know that behaviour is functional. We know that behaviour is maintained by environmental processes around it. So as well as doing something about the vulnerability factors, it's crucial we do functional assessments. We understand what the function of behaviour is, and we have really good behavioural analytic intervention plans around people to address that. And then we also know that historically there's been these set of impact factors that have followed the presentation of challenging behaviour, which have largely been harmful. So if you think historically, people with learning disabilities presented challenging behaviour, they've been put in institutions, they've been excluded from communities, excluded from society. They've been exposed to high levels of psychotropic medication. And what we know now with these restricted practices and high use of medication, they have a almost cyclical impact in making vulnerability factors worse. So if you go back to where I started and think about one vulnerability factor is health. Poor health. We know adults with learning disabilities experience poor health. Those in more poor health seem to be more predisposed to challenging behaviour if the environmental contingencies are in play as well. You give somebody a high level of psychotropic medication, several medications, which people are commonly on, with all of the side effects, you are potentially going to add to their impaired health and increase the vulnerability for challenging behaviour. Because somebody has been challenging in the cinema. And these are the type of things that we hear. I've gone into residential homes and said, "What's happening tonight? What are you doing?" "Oh, not much." "You're not going to the cinema or anything like that?" "Oh, we don't go to the cinema because in 1993, there was an incident where the popcorn got thrown and we've never been back since." And we have that. We all hear these stories, but all these exclusions and all these things that happen, these restrictions around people, then go back and mean that they've got even less meaningful activity. They've got more impoverished social networks. They've got more restricted community presence. And that adds to those vulnerability factors as well. So I think that's what defines PBS, because PBS, we look at what these vulnerability factors are. We look at people and think, you know what, there's some health issues here. We need to address them because they're contributing to, if this young lad's got terrible teeth, he must have toothache. And we're seeing spikes in behavior around that. It's not just contributive to that. There's a spike in behavior related to how the staff are organising his day, for example, but it's being contributed as, so you could define it as a setting event in terms of a health issue by that. So PBS looks at those health issues. They look at the biological factors that contribute to challenging behavior. PBS looks at the psychosocial vulnerabilities. We go to people and say, there's some communication issues here. We need speech and language working with communication. This person's experienced some negative life events. There's been trauma, attachment issues here. We need psychology working with us to look at some potential talking therapy or some reframing around support for that. There's some associated mental health vulnerabilities here. We need psychiatry to be supporting us with that. So in the PBS model, we look at these vulnerability factors and we address them. We look at the maintaining processes. We do a functional assessment. We look at the impact factors and we think we're going to do things differently here. We're not going to restrict people. We're not going to medicate them. We're going to work on their quality of life. We're going to take positive risks. We have that incident in the cinema. We're going to get round a table, work out what went wrong, work out how we can support better when we go next time. And we're going to go back the next weekend because we're going to make sure we get it right because that person loves going to the cinema. And he only tipped the popcorn up because the staff didn't realise he wanted a can of Coke with it and went off ahead without that. He wasn't able to express it. So threw the popcorn down in protest. So we need to get better at understanding that. So for me, that's what sets the PBS framework apart. It's not just concentrating on its maintaining processes, this functional behavior analytic bit. It's wider than that. It's focused on vulnerability factors and impact factors. And that's why, I mentioned medication. We can talk about medication. I think behavior analysts, everywhere they go, need to be asking, what medication are people on? Why are they on it? When was it last reviewed? Is it being successful? And can I contribute to the next review, which looks at it? Because we're trying to look at how we modify environmental aspects for this person. So we need to also review what's happening medication-wise as well. And we need to show a professional curiosity in that and begin to make some inroads into it.
So true. Oh my gosh, yeah. I really like the sort of cyclical model there that sort of brings you right back to making those same thing. You put these interventions into place to sort of deal with some of those vulnerabilities, but those interventions are actually, making them worse or adding to them in some way. I think about a really kind of common physiological ailment that a lot of people in sort of group home settings seem to have, and strangely enough, they seem to be the folks that are not vocal. Is constipation.
Yeah.
So many of these folks are constipated,
Yeah.
and considering that, I think the one thing about sort of these residential sort of settings, and again, I don't really totally agree with this process either, in that it doesn't always embed a lot of choice, but they're often put on quite healthy diets. Often, nutritionist or dietitian designed diets, that follow the whatever the sort of food guide in your particular country might be. So I know for ours, it's heavy vegetable, which, being a vegan myself, I certainly don't mind, but that doesn't work for everybody. And so you would think, with a diet like that constipation shouldn't be prevalent, at all. That, they're doing all the right things, or we're making sure they drink, exactly 2,500 milliliters of water each day, and no more, no less, and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So what's going on? Well, it's the crazy medication that they're on, and that had nothing to do with constipation in the first place, but has caused constipation. Of course, now because of constipation, now they're on stool softeners and laxatives and those sorts of things. And of course, that's now resulted in dehydration and, actual, internal injuries to the point of, or that's actually resulted in, the onset of new challenging behavior, like anal digging and smearing and all these sorts of things. And that cycle just continues. And I think this is a kind of a nice segue into the other kind of area that you've been doing a lot of really great work in, looking at overprescribing medication and drug interactions and those sorts of things. So maybe we could kind of jump into that area and kind of the work you've been doing there.
Yeah. Well, you're so right. When I kind of fell into some of the drug and medication research almost by accident, because my interest in this came about when we were trying to find out the prevalence of challenging behavior. And when we were trying to look at the vulnerability factors, we did surveys on the total population of adults in Jersey with a learning disability, and as well as getting behavioral data, we also got some personal and demographic data. And one of the questions was about medication, quite by chance really at the time. But I was struck when I was going round these settings, when I asked that question, the sheer number of medications people were on, and it shocked me. And when I turn around to staff and say, why are they on that? They'd say, I don't know, been on it for years. And I said, well, what does it do? Don't know. Who prescribes it? Well, I think they just get repeat prescriptions from the clinician. And so it started to worry me. So when we finished that bit about prevalence of behavior and vulnerability factors, we started to have a look and thought, let's do some analysis of some of this medication stuff. And this had coincided a couple of years after Rory Sheehan had done a huge study in the UK across GP surgeries that discovered that around 1 in 2 adults with learning disabilities are on psychotropic medication. So they're the medications of the mind, usually prescribed for mental health issues. So we're talking that 50% of adults with learning disabilities are on these real, potentially potent medications, psychotropic medications. So we had a look in Jersey and thought, well, what is it? What is it here? And lo and behold, it was less in the UK, but it was still around 40% in Jersey. And the prevalence of things like Movicol, lactulose for constipation was really high as well. And that wasn't just associated with some of the other medications. It was also associated with the people that had the 40% that had nothing to do in a day, the sedentary lifestyle type group, the group that had a lot of time chilling in front of a TV as well, the lack of exercise group as well. So we began to think, there's a bit of an issue here, and we had a look into it. And what we discovered was that if you had defined challenging behavior, certainly in Jersey, you were twice as likely to be prescribed psychotropic medication than if you didn't have a behavioral issue. And in terms of antipsychotics, you were 3 times as likely to be prescribed an antipsychotic if you were displaying challenging behavior than not. An antipsychotic might be helpful if you're experiencing psychosis, but how many of that group displaying challenging behavior was their behavior as a result of psychosis? When we were going around doing functional assessments, adjusting people's support, understanding the function behind their behavior, understanding what they were trying to communicate with some of that, and making really successful inroads with our outcome study showed really great improvements to behavioral issues from the work, PBS work we were doing. So we began to think, what is going on with this? Why are people being prescribed so much of this toxic medication that does have those very side effects that you mentioned? That stuff that causes people impacts on their sleep, impacts on their diet, on their on their health. People were putting on weight. People were getting constipated, feeling nauseous, having headaches. And you imagine you add these cocktails of medications also to people that have communication impairments. And then you do begin to worry about, how do people communicate the side effects back and let us know that they're in discomfort from some of this? And we also wondered at the time, and I'm not sure too much research has been done on this, but in terms of, is a higher prevalence of medication use in people that actually lack capacity to consent? So are we seeing more people, greater degrees of medication use on people where others are making the decision around it as well, as opposed to them consenting personally? So it's a huge, huge issue. And obviously there's big campaigns in the UK. We have Stop the Overprescribing of Medication, doing some work. But I guess my dismay with some of it is that you go back 30, 40 years, some of the papers that were coming out then, we were repeating. The research is the same. You're going on 30, 40 years, and we're still seeing overprescribing of medication. The recent study one of my colleagues did Martin McMahon, where they looked at the prevalence of drug-to-drug interactions. So he was concerned that people are on multiple different psychotropics. And if you look at the research, there's certain different psychotropic medications that really is advised not to be prescribed with others. Yet there's a large proportion of these people on those medications, some of which have life-threatening interactions as well. So we're taking significant medical risks with people here in terms of the medication they are on. And that worries me. And that can't be right. And that simply can't be right. And then when you go to settings and people say, well, they don't know why they're on it. So if they don't know why they're on it, the people who are supporting individuals don't know what the side effects are. They don't know what to look out for it. The people can't report it. Clinicians are just putting repeat prescriptions out and not reviewing it. So we need to do something about this. And if you think that people with prevalent challenging behavioral issues are more likely to be on this, if we are getting involved as behavioral analysts, as PBS practitioners with these individuals, I think we need to be asking questions about this. And I think behavioral analysts can be really helpful partners to prescribers as well. And despite that monologue of anti-medication speech I've just given, I'm not anti-medication. And I have seen, I've young people that have ADHD, for example, where some methylphenidate alongside some adjustments we've made in terms of classrooms and support has made a great difference. I've had some adults that have had with learning disabilities have had some associated mental health issues, and some of the medication has been really helpful in terms of that. So I think when medication is given for its prescribed purpose, I think there's a place. But when we start using it off license for behavior, that's when I start to get worried. So what I would be saying to behavioral analysts and practitioners listening and involved in this is, when you go and you get referrals and you involve with people, ask what they're on, ask the people why they're on it, when it was prescribed, who's reviewing it, who's measuring if it's of any benefit. And if you get a case and a clinician, as you're working, says, I'd like to trial this individual on some medication and see how that impacts on some of these behavioral issues, say, great, I've got data sheets in place. We're monitoring the behavior. You put your start date on that, and I will graph up the impact of your medication intervention on my graph. And when we review in 4 weeks, we'll be able to see very clearly if it's made a significant difference. And we'll keep reviewing it based on that aspect. And I think with our expertise in terms of data and monitoring, we could present that and then actually either evidence where medication is helpful, or also provide the evidence where it's made no impact whatsoever and we need to stop it. And encouraging people to work with clinicians to come off medication and to think about the environmental changes that we can make, as opposed to using medication to try to fix people and fix their behavior internally, as opposed to seeing it what we all do as an environmental issue.
The third secret word is specialist. And have you seen that successful? Like, have you seen, doctors kind of responding to a behavior analyst bringing a graph in the room and sort of being on board with that idea? Or how do you sort of get the doctor to sort of partner with you in the first place?
I guess certainly over here, my experience is it has depended on clinician. You have some clinicians that are more amenable to this than others. I think I have found learning disability nurses great advocates for this approach. And quite often, certainly the people in Jersey that are on medication and issues, we have learning disability nurses within our community team who can be the link between the psychiatrist or the prescriber and the PBS team looking and working on some of these. So I think they can be helpful as well. But I also think the prescribers are under pressure as well. And that's where a lot of this comes from. Because I think historically and currently there is a lack of behavior analysts, there's a lack of psychologists. So psychiatrists are overwhelmed with families and staff teams and others coming to them and saying, we've got issues here, we've got huge risk, we've got somebody self-harming, we've got high levels of aggression, we've got all this going on. And they're putting pressure on psychiatrists to do something. And they often haven't got the option to say, oh, there's a PBS guy over there. Do the PBS work first. Let's see what environmental adaptations we can make and come back. They don't have that luxury. People are putting pressure on. So they think, what have I got in my armory to try to make a difference? Well, I can give you a script. I can give a prescription for medication. So I'm not saying this is coming from any, reflection on bad practice. I think quite often prescribers would like behavioral analysts and PBS prescribers working alongside them to have a different option and to be working with them. So they can be focused on the ones that do have mental health issues, which are impacting, where medication will be effective and appropriate. So we need to go to them and say, we're here, we can help, as opposed to being, I guess, critics on the side. And, it's easy to criticize, but it's less difficult to understand why people are prescribing and say, well, I'm here to help.
For sure. The other piece that kind of confuses me, and I'm curious sort of what you found and sort of, or what folks you've been working with have found when they're interacting with physicians. How do we get to the point of a psychiatrist prescribing a medication that doesn't interact well with another medication?
Yeah, that's difficult. I think certainly, I don't know what what the systems are elsewhere, but I'm also aware that we have different prescribers at times as well. So people might go to their GP for medication. People might go to a psychiatrist for medication. We have nurse prescribers now in place. And I think that's an issue in itself. There's somebody central overseeing all of the prescriptions, so that doesn't happen, and it's measured. And we've been doing our research, and we'd have people with up to 30 different medications at one time.
Wow.
And a number of those medications are medications to challenge the side effects of other medications.
Yep.
You prescribe an antipsychotic, then you prescribe another medication to help with the Parkinsonian effects, and you prescribe a laxative to help with the constipation. You then prescribe a sleeping tablet because of the sleep's impact, and it just expands and expands. So I'm not sure I have any answers to that. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't envy their work. Again, they're such a valuable commodity. Even in Jersey, we are short of psychiatrists in our children's services at the moment, and they do a great job, but they're under such pressure and they're working such long hours with this. So I guess to avoid this, we need to invest in these psychosocial alternatives. We need more BCBAs and PBS practitioners and psychologists and therapists and support staff who have a good grasp of quality of life issues.
Mm-hmm.
So we have alternatives for prescribers who are under such pressure. So, that would be my inclination. Whilst at the same time, I think we need more work, and it does need to be more adherence to guidance. We have clear, nice guidance in the UK over prescribing, which clearly says, this has a place alongside functional assessments, alongside community-based support, environmental adjustments. But because of the lack of those options, it's not happening. So we have 30 years on, we have the same results, which is just simply depressing.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder, is this just like a simple matter of, well, maybe simple is not the right word, but matter of sort of medical records being passed along, and those sorts of things, is it, I sort of make the assumption that when my doctor prescribes me a medication, they're going to know what other medications I'm on, but maybe that's not the case. Maybe I just don't understand sort of the whole medical record system, and especially if, someone's been prescribed something as a child and then ages into adulthood, do things sort of change that way? I know I had one fella who I was working with, and he was in his late 20s, and he's on some of these really high doses of medication that were prescribed to him when he was 12, sort of, just hitting puberty, when all the challenging behavior were, really coming out because of all the sort of the puberty effects as well. And those medications never changed, and he went on to sort of be on a whole bunch of other medications, and so. Yeah, maybe it's just a lack of sharing of information. I don't know.
Yeah. It could be. I think there's pressures on time. Another solution is that certainly in the UK, it's good practice that every adult with a learning disability has an annual health check. I'd like to see some of the prevalence of compliance towards that, because if that is done properly as per guidance, we should have a natural annual review every year for somebody, where with all of the clinicians around the table that looks at the medication and says, goodness, they've been on this for 12 years, or they've been on it for a number of years, and look, they're now on this and this and this as well. Maybe we should start trying to reduce this and take somebody off this, and let's have a period where we take people off medication, and we see now as they're older whether it's required, or whether now we've got the PBS team we can look at doing. So I think that's a solution as well. If we make sure that people have regular reviews for their medication, and maybe that is an area learning disability nurses can focus on and champion.
And you touched on that a couple of times. That's something I always found interesting and kind of neat about the UK, was this concept of learning disability nurses. I think also just sort of a few terms here for folks that maybe not familiar with, how the UK labels things. Sort of in North America, a learning disability sort of falls under kind of things like, specific, and I could be butchering this, but sort of specific disabilities really related to kind of academics and education.
Okay.
So like dyslexia, dyscalculia, those sorts of things. And then we sort of, everything else kind of falls into sort of developmental disability, which I think is sort of what you folks call learning disabilities over there.
Yeah. We would pitch the other as learning difficulties. We would pitch the other. So
I do like the learning disabilities term much better. I think it actually has a better term. But anyway, you have learning disability nurses, which is not something that I was ever familiar with, and I became familiar with it through the great work of a younger disability nurse at the time that kind of got into PBS, Jonathan Beebe. And he's done a really good job of sort of kind of disseminating. And so he was sort of one of the first people I kind of fell upon in the UK before I found sort of all the great academic research, because he had his own little blog going around, and he was doing ratings and how these learning disability nurses were getting trained as PBS practitioners. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. That's exactly what we need. Because we do have mental health support nurses. That's sort of our version of the same thing kind of over here. But, they don't have that sort of PBS component. And so I love how the UK is, and I'm not really sure how it formed or if it's regulated or what it is, but that all these learning disability nurses are also trained in PBS and so have that perspective. And I think that's a real plus for you folks, and something maybe we can model off over here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really cool work you're doing. You share with me a lot of great research and really kind of see what PBS looks like over there. And I think you guys are doing some really neat things that we can learn from. I think someone's got to start something like the Stay Up Late program over here, because I think that's just the most brilliant thing I've ever heard of, and a real game changer, I think, for the quality of life for folks. Before we kind of depart here, maybe you could just tell me kind of what projects you're working on now, and then maybe sort of just any sort of last words for the listening audience.
Yeah, I'm working wise. I've recently slightly changed and am working in the area of children's mental health, overseeing our local child and adolescent mental health service over here. So I'm even beginning to see in that population how some of the PBS approach is helpful there, and how the psychosocial responses as opposed to the medicalizing of some of these conditions is useful. So I'm beginning to look at that over here in terms of that bit. I've been involved in some of the working groups in terms of some of the updates to the definitions of PBS, which is coming up this year. I'm going to be involved at the conference in October. Right. One of the things I'm going to be talking about quality of life, but I'm also going to be talking about positive risk taking as well. That's something I'm really interested in as well, in terms of we have this intent to improve people's quality of life, but the people that get referred to our service, some of the behavior is risky. It's risky to themselves and to others. And that's a question I was often asked. This is what staff members say to me: how do I take people out? How do I go back to the cinema? What if they have that incident and there's a child there, and the risks are around this? But if we don't take positive risks, we're not going to improve people's quality of life. So I'm really interested in that. So I'm going to be talking at the conference about that. And we've done a bit of work with that, particularly over here within organizations. How do organizations support this idea of positive risk taking, and involve some of our health and safety more minded practitioners as well, to make sure we are risk assessed and paperwork's up on these issues and we're compliant with things, but also pushing the boundaries. I've sent adults with learning disabilities who've never left Jersey before, with high levels of challenging behaviour, on the ferry for a day trip to France, which people have been sat behind sofas all day worried about. But we've done it because it's important, because that's what they wanted. That's what they wanted to do, and their behaviour has impacted on them being able to leave Jersey in the past. And it's only by doing some of those things that we see improvements to that. And we see. So I'm interested in that idea of positive risk taking, and we're going to do some further work on that. I've also got a number of follow-up studies that I need to work on with some of the existing data we've got from some of the work. So one of the ideas is to look at, I talked about vulnerability factors, and when we did the study to look at vulnerability factors, we also did this idea of working out cumulative risk indices. So that's quite interesting. So what we did in that was we added up, we worked out what the vulnerability factors are, and then we added up if people had more than one vulnerability factor using some different statistical methods. And what that showed is if quite obviously, really, that the more vulnerability factors are, the more greater risk you were of presenting challenging behavior. So there's this idea of cumulative risk. So there's also a potential with some longitudinal data we've got to see whether these cumulative risk indices potentially predict the future occurrence of challenging behavior. Now, if so, that's potentially helpful as almost like a screening tool, particularly for when people are younger. So we can potentially produce a tool that says, we've got a young person here, how's their health? How's their communication skills? How's their engagement? How's their self-determination? And if we can list all these appropriate and work out what the cumulative list is, maybe we can get in early at some of the more protective interventions that could potentially prevent the future occurrence of challenging behavior as well. And that's the thing about PBS, is about preventative. It's about doing good quality of life and having good antecedent interventions that prevent this issue of challenging behavior in the first place. And I think the other concluding thing that I'd like to leave by as well, which came out in my research as well, is that it's a very rare issue that we get to somebody never showing any what would be defined inappropriate or challenging behavior ever again. And I don't think any of us get to that point. And if anybody came into any of our houses and did a behavioral ratings tool or chased us around with ABC sheets and monitored us continuously, we would all show a level of behavior. And I think that's why the PBS emphasis is on this idea of quality of life and not so much focusing on this idea of behavioral challenge. And in our outcome study, we were really successful as a service, but very rarely did we get to a stage where people never, ever showed a level of behavioral challenge again. What we did get to, though, was a stage where people were presenting a level of behavior which was much more common of the expected level of the general population. And I think sometimes potentially reframing what we're trying to do in our areas is better. And I think that puts less pressure on staff and services. And what good is getting a total extinction of challenging behavior if that person has an absolutely miserable life? And we could do that. But most of the referrals I get, I could guarantee you I could produce a week where that person doesn't display any behavior. But I have to balance that with that person also doing all the things they love, having a great quality of life, and knowing I can't always control all the environmental contingencies that impact on that. So sometimes we might have a big scary dog run up on a beach that invokes an issue, but I'm going to work with that person on how they manage dogs going forward, but I'm not just going to never take them on the beach again. So that's where the balance comes in as well, the balance between, reducing levels of behavior, but also making sure we balance that out with people having good quality of life and not put pressure on total extinction.
I love the idea of sort of ordinary person, level of challenging behavior as sort of a metric. Because I think we're often expecting perfection, and if we don't get perfection, it's right back to sort of restrictive practices and safety plans, and sort of all these sorts of things. And I know for me, if I'm frustrated one day and decide I'm going to, throw a plate across the room, that shouldn't now limit me from going to work the next day.
Absolutely.
And so on and so forth.
Yeah, and that's what we found. We used the behavioral problems inventory to assess levels of challenging behavior. Now that has a definition such as being verbally abusive. And what we found is when we were using that most people were scoring some level on it. Most of us might get grumpy and swear at somebody and do things. Most of us might yell and scream. So there's a level of behavior that I think is more normative, and then there's a level of behavior which is more clinically concerning. So what we've tried to do is, instead of give ourselves targets of a reduction in the clinical level of behavior as opposed to total extinction as our target, getting people much more towards the norm of most people as opposed to never showing these issues again, which I think is unrealistic.
And that behavior problems inventory, is that a tool that can kind of provide that line, as it were?
Yeah, so it's a useful tool, and it's actually freely available online as well. We use a short form in Jersey. It's called a BPIS, a Behavioral Problems Inventory short form. It's got 3 categories of behavior: a self-injurious category, aggressive destructive, and a stereotyped behavior category. And it rates 30 most typical behaviors in terms of frequency and severity. So it's quite helpful. I find it very helpful at point of referral, because quite often people refer to services for behavior that impacts on them as opposed to the person. So we get lots of referrals for aggression because they impact on others, less so on issues that could be more internal that do impact on that person's quality of life. So it helps us at referral work out what's going on from a more evidence-based approach. And we did a paper in the TISARD where we used some statistical analysis to produce some scores from this. So if you use this as a pre and post test measure, you can get a behavioral score from it. And then we worked out what score reductions would needed that would indicate statistically significant behavioral reduction and clinically significant behavioral reduction. So that's our aim as a service. Our aim as a service is we do the BPIS at the beginning, and then we do it later when our interventions are in. And what we hope to see is clinically significant reduction in the behavioral scores between the 2 rating scales. So we obviously have our we have all our other frequency tallies and ABC tallies and episodic severity measures. So we have different measures, our more behavioral analytic measures that we would graph as well. But we just find this as another helpful measure that kind of sits as a pre and post test measure with that score. So that paper is in the TISAD Learning Disability Review. If people Google my name, Bowring, and TISAD LDR and BPIS, that paper will come up as well. So I think that's useful as well. And I think it's a slightly different mindset when we start thinking about that than post, total reduction of challenging behavior.
Absolutely. It makes you think of, I'm definitely going to, I'm going to have show notes I'm going to share. I've been taking copious notes. We'll have, all these resources available for folks. It makes me think of, and I'm going to be touching on this, I think, in a future episode. It's not so much about whether the individual engages in challenging behavior ever again. So say the individual goes 3-4 months with no problems, and then just has one blow up and kind of moves on. That one blow up, it actually isn't really a big deal for the individual. It's a big deal for the staff. And I think it's almost like a trauma trigger, I think, for staff. Because staff have been traumatized by the intensive amounts of challenging behavior. And to sort of see it again, it brings it all back. He's gone back to zero, back to day one. We got to start all over again. And so I think some supports in there for helping with staff trauma is probably going to be really important as well.
The work of Peter Baker in the UK is really is really good about that, and I think that is important. If we think of changing culture as well, the constant exposure to challenging behaviour for staff teams is telling, and Peter's research shows that the amount of features of post-traumatic stress disorder that staff show, and families actually as well, through the constant exposure to challenging behaviour. I don't think that should be neglected, and there's work that's needed on that. But also, I think that's why data is helpful as well. And sometimes we go to meetings and review things, and people say, "Oh, we haven't had a good week this week. We've had a couple of issues," and it is worth going and reminding people. A year ago, you were getting 2 incidents an hour, and look at our data and look at our graph where we've gone to. And perspective, I think, is helpful sometimes. Behavior is emotive, isn't it? When we're in the middle of it, it's really difficult. And that's why I think we need all these data tools that we use in our ABA practice and with BPIS. We need those to be able to give us a more objective view and to help staff take a more objective view at times.
Wow. Yeah, that's so cool. Really, I'm definitely going to try to have you back maybe in a year or so we can talk more about sort of the positive risk taking and the cumulative risk indices. I think those are really interesting, and I think can really provide a new perspective for folks kind of working in these areas. I definitely want to have you back and talk about that if you'd be interested.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much, Darren, for just being on the show and for sharing all your work. I love sort of the range of areas that you're kind of covering, sort of each sort of important piece, and I think for a lot of the folks that are practicing PBS, especially over here, they're going to get a lot of really new ideas that they hadn't considered sort of in their PBS practice, which I think is going to be a lot of fun. So thanks again for being on. It was really, really great having you.
No, thank you for having me. It was an absolute pleasure, and absolute pleasure to talk PBS.